Hello, I'm Simon Williams of League Football Education, and I'm joined by Troy Townsend, who is Head of Player Engagement at Kick It Out. Troy's taken a break from travelling the length and breadth of the country, educating and supporting football on matters of racism and discrimination. Hello, Troy.
Hi, Si. Thanks for having me.
Always a privilege. It's Black History Month, celebration, an opportunity for us all. In your words, what does Black History Month represent and mean to you?
Always start with an easy one, Si. It means just that. It means, first and foremost, recognizing and celebrating, in our sport, the steep history of Black contributions, whether they be on the field of play, whether they be off the field of play, whether they be connected to the game. It's a real opportunity to step away from the norm and the kind of controversy that still exists in this space, and to really look at where our leaders are, the people that, laid the path for the likes of myself and many others to excel in this sport, and often in the past, Black History Month has been a kind of month where we then talk about fatality. We talk about how Black people have been belittled and dehumanized, and those stories have been told, and I don't want to do anything negative or say anything negative about those stories, because they need to be told for people to get the fuller picture as to where we are now. But our contributions to football and beyond are massive. And look, I want to be totally honest here, and I know that you want me to be honest as well. I'm not truly a fan of Black History Month. I've worked in the education system. I've worked obviously educating here in our sport. And I'm honestly, particularly in the education system, it's a tick box exercise. Many don't know what to do during that period of time. They set children a task that I'm not even sure that they fully understand and fully, get. And it's not about promoting positive role models and positive figures, so that those children, in our educational system can inspire to feel that they can achieve later on in their lives. I suppose we've done the same in football, to be totally honest, and it's only recently, and I'll be honest with you, since the George Floyd murder, that I invested some significant time in that Black History Month for stories to be told, for people to recognize that it's not just the stories of a George Floyd, but there's so many different ways that we can continue to educate right across the year. Disappointingly, I felt we went back to type last year, but this year I've been infused. I've made sure that I've got out and I've provided as much insight into footballing figures as much as I can and possible during this month. Some amazing interviews, some amazing stories, seeing players overcome adversity and making it at the top level of the game. Why wouldn't you want to hear those stories that we've never heard in the past? So, I'm jumping about a bit here, but absolutely, the significance of the month should never be a month. But if we still talk about the history of the contributions of Black and brown people in our game, then surely it will start to extend beyond the month.
Absolutely. And history doesn't just start and stop. It's always been written, and it's not just 1 month a year.
Yeah.
Thinking about figures, and a name recently written into the history books is Benjamin Adeji. Can you tell me a little bit about his story?
Well, this is a real tough one, because when I say it's a real tough one, I don't just mean in regards to Ben. I mean in regards to Black players who had laid that path and journey for others to follow, but yet their journeys have been wiped away from our history. Their journeys have not been recognized, and it's only, it's crazy, but it's significant years later that they become recognized for their contributions. And in Ben's case, listen, he wasn't a full international, he wasn't a full England international, but he was, and he has been recognized now as the first Black player to play for England at any level. The stories in the past have always been around the great Laurie Cunningham, making his debut in 1977 for the England under-21s, or that dashing fullback Viv Anderson making his full England debut in 1978. But if you go back in time, just recently as well, recognised with a statue outside of Plymouth Argyle, Jack Leslie, who basically was denied his England cap and was not recognised and was banished into kind of the vaults, if that's what I want to say, you know, because no one wanted to recognise his story. And Ben has been the same, to be totally honest. He I think 1971 he made his England schoolboys debut. And you think England schoolboys, but as far as I'm aware, it was in front of a 70,000 crowd at Wembley Stadium. I mean, just imagine that first and foremost for a schoolboy, you know, to go out, to walk out at Wembley. I've walked out at Wembley, the old Wembley, and there definitely wasn't 70,000 in there at the time, that's for sure. And I still was shaking at the time, you know. But, you know, so he plays for the England schoolboys. He becomes the first, you know, black player to represent England at any level. And his story is banished. And I just can't, I say I can't understand it, Si, but I can absolutely understand it. There were not, you know, there were not the black players around in that period of time that we have now, obviously. He was seen as a bright star. He's kind of, he was dubbed like the boy Pele. They used to call him Pele because of the amount of goals that he scored at schoolboy level. The records say something ridiculous like nearly 400 goals in 3 seasons. I mean, I don't know how you do that, to be totally honest, but that's what the records say. I think he represented England on 4 or 5 occasions. But then it was just gone. His story was gone. It wasn't recognized. And it was gone to the likes of myself as well, who didn't understand who would never have known of Ben, who would never have known Ben's story. You know, I was only a nipper at that time. And at that time, I was, you know, the age I wasn't even looking for role models, to be totally honest. But what I can't understand is why that recognition was taken away from Ben. Why, you know, he had to fight to be recognized in the system, you know, fight to have his name, you know, put against the very significant names that were already, you know, up in lights, you know, representing England. Why, as a black player, basically was his history just destroyed, you know? It's a significant, really significant moment. It should be a really significant moment. And he couldn't enjoy the moment. And these are the things when we talk about legacies and people who have laid the trail. He didn't have an opportunity to enjoy it because he was always fighting for his name to be recognized and to be established as the first black player to play for England. It's only recently that, obviously, after a campaign that, and it seems to always be good people starting up campaigns to recognize, you know, those that have gone before. It's only recently that he has been recognized. And I know the recent England games, you know, he finally got that recognition at Wembley as well. But why? The questions
51 years later.
Yeah. The questions are always why? Why? Once we recognized, once it was known, once Ben was that person, it still took ages. And I don't know, there's something in our history against black players that, you know, it's very, very hard for many people to comprehend. And so actually never got to rejoice in that moment, you know, and rejoicing 50 years later, for me, that's not rejoicing, is it? That's just, hold on, my name will now be in history. But look what it's taken for me to get there, you know. So yeah, a significant name, someone that people will need to get to know, you know, belatedly. And, you know, it's quite fortunate that he's still here, to be totally honest, to be recognized, because often it's when players have passed and, you know, family members are trying to do their utmost to kind of get their name in lights the way that it should have been at the time.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important we tell the stories now when we do what we can. You mentioned some names there. John Charles is another one for people to look up as well. All first black players to play for England in different eras at different age groups, and similarly because they haven't been fully recognised by football history,
Absolutely.
which they did have a right to be. Sometimes success can be taken from adversity, from overcoming it. No doubt a lot of the people celebrated throughout this month will have had to do exactly that. When it comes to adversity, and when I say that, I'm referring to persecution here in this particular example. So ill, unfair treatment from society because of race. Can you talk to me about the rights that young players, young people have
in sport?
In sport.
In sport, to be fair, every person, remember, anyone on the field of play, that's their place of work. It's as simple as that, Si. It's their place of work. So they have the same rights and they have the same should have the same acknowledgements as anyone working wherever they may work, in an office, on a building site. We're all protected. We're all protected by the employment law. We're all protected by the Equality Act. And those players, they're no different. But for some reason, because their names are attached to football and to sport, they get treated differently. And they get treated differently in a way where they almost have to fight for their very existence. And that fight and battle still continues today in 2022. So when you talk about what rights they have the same rights as anybody else that is employed by any organization. Footballers are seen as entertainers. They're the ones that bring the joy, the happiness, the sorrow at times and the pain at times on the field of play. But they have a right for their existence to be protected. And unfortunately, for far too many years to mention, that hasn't happened. And that's not their responsibility. The responsibility there lies in the game. And the game needs to find a better way to protect players from the vile abuse that continues to exist. And I want people to understand this, that many players will say, oh, doesn't matter. Don't worry, I'll get on with it. And whilst I applaud them, they then don't share the downtimes, the negative times, the times when actually they may not be playing at their best. They may not be enjoying, the very thing that they're paid to do. And then those traumatic experiences shine through. And then they doubt themselves, and then they're wondering if it's going to happen again. And then they're maybe looking into the crowds to make sure that they don't get targeted, or if they do, they can identify someone. And for me, those are and I know that sometimes telling those stories can be quite painful. And it's almost like you're dragging the story out again, and you're doing yourself no benefit or no good. But I don't know another way to influence society to understand that young players, older players, of people of color, the experience that they go through every time they receive racial discrimination in their work environment. That would be like me sitting in an office tapping away on a laptop and someone calls me a racially motivated term. I'm sorry, I have the evidence. I put in a complaint. I would expect that person to be eliminated from the workplace environment immediately, particularly if there's witnesses. But it seems like we continue, and I keep saying the game continues to make excuses in this space that leaves our players to be targeted again and again and again. And I won't mention names here, but certain types of players seem to be targeted more than others, by the way. So we know that because of our Kick It Out's stats, we know that there's one player that is targeted, particularly on social media, more than any other player. One player targeted more. And then we look at the list and we go down and, but why is this player targeted? Why is he continually targeted by people on social media? He was targeted again only a couple of weeks ago. And the reason he was targeted because he scored 2 goals in a game. Someone didn't like it. So, this is not on the onus is, although players make a stance, and although, we could, if we get into talking about taking a knee, so we'll never come off today. But I know people look for players to take a stance. And I think the players took the most significant stance in this space when they decided to take a knee, by the way, more than anything that any other organization has done. And that shows the power and the gravitas of the players. But eventually then the abuse continued because they were taking the knee. So their stance against racial discrimination and to show football that it needed to do more, the players decided to take a knee and got abused again. Nothing's changed. But I think what that did is show the power and the significance of the player voice. But it shouldn't just be the player voice. It should be the player voice aligned with the authorities doing what is right to protect them in their places of work.
I hear you. Young men, young women putting the coat on, going to work and being racially abused is not okay. And if anybody's experiencing that or is aware of somebody else who's experienced that, what should they do?
Listen, the first thing you do is report it, but that could be very, very easy to say. And then you go through an experience of reporting something, particularly on social media platforms, and you get an instant message back that says it doesn't break community guidelines. If you're working in our sport, obviously always report to your employer. If it's anything that is via social media, you take a screenshot, you hand that in and let them deal with it. On the field of play, you tell the referee, there's steps in place to make sure that you are protected. So you inform the officials. The process is quite long, and this is what I battle with our authorities all the time. Nothing should take 6 months to come to conclusion, because that person has to live that experience all the way through to the end. The demands on the players to talk about their experience are far too extreme. But those are the processes in place at the moment. Obviously, this aside, last season, 2021-22 was my busiest season in supporting players right across all the levels in regards to their victimization and what to do next and what else do you need, and know that there's a friendly face that's in here batting for you on the other side. It was my busiest season, regardless of what level it was that they were being abused at. And even though they get that support, a lot of the times they don't get the outcomes for the allegations that they put forward to the authorities. But I don't want that to put players off from always reporting, because I hear far too many stories of what's the point. I'm just going to live the experience again, and I'm going to live the experience again. So we need to keep encouraging players of no matter what age and their parents, if they're younger players, to report, to make sure that people are aware, to tell their stories, so that they hopefully can at least get these people held accountable for the actions that they're taking against them.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a responsibility for everybody, be it players, peers, friends, family, staff within football clubs and governing bodies,
Absolutely.
parents and education. I heard James Ward-Prowse talking about the impact of the knee. And although the whole agenda isn't understood by his son or daughter, it was leading them to ask questions about what is this all about. And there's an opportunity there for us all to fight, educate, and work together, so it's a safe place for everybody to work.
But I think that's the bit that people are missing, the people that don't want to understand and don't want to recognize what the players are trying to achieve. What the taking as the knee has done over a long period of time is continue the conversation, is to not let it slide off of the radar, is to make sure that anyone that says, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? There's an answer to it, or there's a conversation about it. That is the best form of education. And so you take that away, the questions don't get asked no more. The taking of the knee devalues. The conversation goes quiet. Yeah. We don't have to talk about it. So for me, it's massive.
Makes so much sense. And I'm just thinking about history. I mean, it's, as I said, it's being written all the time. And it's time for all young people to sort of grab the pens and start writing their own history. Marcus Rashford, massive role model for everybody. It was somebody I was speaking to not so long ago saying that their son had come home with a book, saying, look, Marcus Rashford's provided us all with this book. Had no idea who Marcus Rashford was, what he did, but they knew he'd given him a free book. And I think that's an example of particularly members of the England team, thinking Reece James, Bukayo Saka, Raheem Sterling. We've got so many positive role models right at the top of the game that society sees in such a positive way. And challenging government policy, fighting for good causes, working in soup kitchens and just improving the lives of others. And when we talked before about celebration, there's absolutely no shortage of Black people doing amazing things, people with dual heritage, inspiring millions across the country. And these are the stories that we need to keep right at the top of the agenda in the media, as opposed to the stuff that's beating people down.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, those stories obviously are, just to hear a kid say, I've got a book from Marcus Rashford and I don't know who he is amazing. It's just amazing, because in a sense, that's what Marcus wants. He wants you to know who he is by reading his book, so that's the value there. But so I would also say, and you've mentioned some really, really significant figures there who are massively important, because they are not just British stars, they're world stars, they're on the world platform. But there are so many others who will not get the same recognition, who are doing work that is just as invaluable, whether it's in their communities, whether it's, back home for them, where their families come from, whether it's in their, in their local football club environment. There are so many people that do exactly the same kind of work that will never get the praise beyond locally, to be totally honest, or beyond potentially back home. They won't be in the media spotlight. That's what I'm trying to say, but that they absolutely provide so much. And you got to realize the local community are in awe of their local heroes. So those are to be recognized as well. And I think, we'll always talk about your Rashfords, your Sterlings, and those alike. But there are so many figures. When the players come into this game, they really invest in the game and they realize their responsibilities as well. And their responsibilities go beyond 90 minutes of a Saturday or Sunday or a midweek. Their responsibilities as young role models will continue forever. And I think what I've seen is a real understanding of that. And for players to really recognize who they're inspiring. Because remember, not everyone can be a professional footballer. As much as we all try, and I know as much as I tried, I know you were there as well, so, not everyone can have that status. And I think, the recognition needs to go, like we said with Ben, and like we'll say when with other important figures. Ben was a role model, but no one knew he was, because he wasn't given the opportunity to be that role model, which probably set us back. It was another 6 years before we got the Laurie Cunningham and the Viv Anderson, 6-7 years. But actually, we could have started previously. And actually, if we go back in history, the recognition would have been there anyway. And maybe it wouldn't have taken so long for Black players to break through in the English game,
Yeah. Moving outside of England here, I wanted to ask you about this. Dual heritage, the Jamaica squad. I see this in the international break, and I always just think, wow, I absolutely love it. You've got Michail Antonio. He's obviously had call-ups to the England squad. Bobby Decordova-Reid, Ravel Morrison, Leon Bailey, just to name a few, have all agreed, possibly together. I like to think they did it together to represent Jamaica. I mean, how good is that, and what does it highlight?
Listen, it highlights that sometimes we've missed talent. Particularly in the case of Michail Antonio, who, like you said, was called up for the England squads but never represented England. But it's good that they've, their background and their heritage is enough of a pull for the Jamaica. Because listen, the Jamaican national squad, 1998, they did it before. That they decided that they wanted to look at English-based players, and obviously a colleague of mine, Marcus Gow, and the likes of Frank Sinclair and Paul Hall and
Robbie Earle.
Yeah, Robbie Earle. Sorry, how could I forget him? When Jamaica qualified for the World Cup for the first time, they were littered with players who played in our English game and who decided to transfer over and, represent the country of their parents' birth in the World Cup, And I think it's great that it's happening again. Because it does mean that there's an opportunity to escalate the nation and potentially get them back into, first of all, Gold Cups, and then potentially, who knows, the World Cup again. the unfortunate thing, and I must mention this, is that behind the scenes, it's not always as professional as it should be. And those players find that when they do represent their countries, as Paul Hall eventually took over as manager for a period of time, that things are not always as kind of great behind the scenes as they should be for international level football. So I would always say to those nations and those smaller nations that do entice those players that have played nationally all over the place, but come to represent Jamaica, make sure everything's in place, make sure things are done properly. You know, you want things on the pitch to be great, and you've got to match that with things off the pitch to be great as well. Sorry, Si, I'm on a little soapbox here because I know the story of how difficult it was for Paul Hall to even get, you know, to get home from an international one day. You know, there was no flights booked and that. But the positivity of that is that we then inspire another nation or another young cohort of young fans that believe that they can become potentially a Mikel Antonio or Ravel Morrison and see that they can go and play internationally wide and then come back and be the heroes to the motherland, as we used to call it. And it's important, again, that we inspire the next generation to believe they can. You know, Jamaicans, people from the Caribbean, you know, they've had their period of wanting to be cricketers. You know, when Viv Richards and Clive Lloyd and all them great figures were around, cricket was the thing. You know, Courtney Walsh, Curtly, sorry, I'm reeling off the names because it was a thing for me as well. You know, and then all of a sudden basketball took over and Jamaicans wanted to go and sort of see the glory and the dollar signs in you know, in basketball, because if you get over to America, you've seen as you've got it made, you know, and we've got to bring football back into the public light almost. And I think, you know, when they can go out and see those players, see those figures, pay money to watch them in the flesh. They can't come over to England, they can't watch them in the flesh, but they would predominantly have seen them on their TV screens. You know, how massive is that for Jamaica as a footballing nation to really start that journey again and bring in those talents from abroad that are playing in such significant leagues, and they can watch them and hopefully get together and, you know, replicate 1998 with maybe qualifying first of all. And I always rib Marcus for this, but you never got out of the group, so we need to go one better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what it does for me is shines a light on heritage, and it allows people to see that someone's nationality is not necessarily just one thing. And I don't think people often like that. So
I've got stories. I've got a story about myself. And again, I had to do my research on this, but I've got Scottish blood in me. You know, and I think if we all do our research, we'll find out that maybe we're not just English or Black English, or, you know, my family tree took a horrible turn, to be totally honest, back in the days of slavery. And all of a sudden, out of Scotland, there's the new Townsends, you know. And for what my ancestors would have gone through, maybe I shouldn't celebrate it so much, but I celebrate it because of what they did go through. So as you know, I've got a son that plays professional football, and you know, he could have represented England and he could have represented Scotland, as well as Cyprus and as well as Jamaica. So there you go. There's the whole kind of background stuff and heritage stuff that maybe we don't identify enough, or maybe people don't visibly look at us and see, you know, we have that makeup in us, but he could have represented 4 nations.
I get it. It's exactly what I was getting at. And I think how amazing is that though as well. I think about Emma Raducanu, you know, as another example, and her being representing Great Britain as a tennis player, and people not being able to really identify with her because she's not solely British or could represent other nations. And I think that really shows where people do struggle to open up their minds and understand that. Well, back in the day, Owen Hargreaves, I was fascinated by the fact he could play for Canada, Germany, England. And that was just one example. But yeah, I guess it's people assuming someone's race and heritage, and that's ignorant. And more respect around this, and society having more flexibility to accept it. There's got to be a way forward. So one final question for you, Troy. If you could choose one person for people to search for, read about after hearing this conversation, who is it?
I actually thought long and hard about this because there's a lot of stories now that are in the public domain, you know. Arthur Wharton. I had the privilege of meeting some of his family at a Black History Month game for Sheffield United recently. Honestly, so I was shaken because knowing the great man's story and what he represented and what he would have gone through. There's me who thinks I can talk in any environment, I can meet anybody and I'll be okay. But I was nervous about meeting them, you know, but that was because the enormity of his story has now been told and is in the public domain. I mentioned Jack Leslie earlier, and yeah, I could have said him as well, but I'm going to go for Albert Johansson. Yeah, there you go. Even you looked at me a little bit surprised, didn't you?
Yeah.
I'm going to go for Albert Johansson, and obviously I'm not going to say anymore because it's for people to research and for people to understand his story in the English game. So yeah, Albert Johansson.
Perfect. Thanks, Troy. Really appreciate your insight and your knowledge. And we'll speak again, and no doubt it won't be long before you're in speaking in face to face in front of the people watching this. So
brilliant. Thank you, Si. I really appreciate it.
Cheers, Troy.